Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our program on En Route to Victory. My name is Dr. Joe Stoltz. I'm the Director of Leadership Programs here in the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Iris de Rode, who is a specialist in the French participation in the American Revolution and more broadly in the history of the Atlantic revolutions. Iris earned her doctoral degree in November 2019 for her PhD dissertation entitled François-Jean de Chastellux, un soldat philosophe dans le monde atlantique à l'époque des Lumières at the University of Paris 8. And while completing her dissertation, she was a research fellow in residence here at the George Washington Presidential Library. So we take a little bit of credit for everything she does, but she makes us proud all the time, so that's easy to do. Her dissertation will be published in French in November of this year. So, if you already read French, there you go. But if that's an issue for you, she is working on an English language adaptation, which will be published next year through the University of Virginia Press. In addition to all these fantastic scholarly pursuits, she is working on a documentary film entitled En Route for Revolution, as well as developing a mobile audio tour app for the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route Association. And fun fact, she plays the accordion. So, Iris, it is my love having you here. This will be exciting. If a little bit of housekeeping, if anybody has any questions while Iris is doing her presentation, just enter them in the chat on whatever platform you are watching on, and we'll get to those as soon as we can. Bonjour, Iris.
Bonjour, Joe. Thank you very much for this lovely introduction. And I want to also thank Mount Vernon and especially the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route Association for organizing this event and putting this together. And so today I'm going to present something on something that happened 240 years ago, exactly on this date. So it's September the 10th, 1781. Here we go. So those who are familiar with Mount Vernon know that quite close to the official entrance, there is a little sign reading this: Washington-Rochambeau route. General Washington in 1781 rode 60 miles in one day from Baltimore to Mount Vernon, which he had not visited for over 6 years. General Rochambeau arrived the next day with his and Washington's staff. They spent September 10th, so that's today, and 11th at Mount Vernon before going on to Fredericksburg. So this is a sign saying, of course, that George Washington came on this very special day to Mount Vernon, but it's in general more a it's a step in the larger frame of the route. So the route is what's the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route today, but at the time, of course, it was the Allied route, so the route that the French and Americans walked together up until Yorktown, because, of course, they were going to fight the British there in the year of 1781. So as for some background information on the route, and then I'll go to the actual presentation of today on the 10th of September, 1781. But before I delve into that, I want to introduce the Washington-Rochambeau National Trail, and of course, the association that is organizing many events this year, because this year is the 240th anniversary of this route. So the route is a 640-mile road today. You can still visit it today and drive with your car or even walk if you're very motivated to see all these places the French and Americans walked together to their victory. So the first leg was from June to July 1781, in which especially the French marched with their 5,000 men French army. They walked from Newport, where they were staying, till Phillipsburg, which is very close to New York, to join the around 4,000 men Continental Army. So you have to imagine that this is a very important logistical operation to have all these people there together with their tents, with their equipment, with their military materiel, and of course, everything you can imagine with them to this place in Phillipsburg in New York. And so there is a second leg. So after staying for a few weeks in New York, on which I'll tell more after, they continued their route to Yorktown. And this happened from August till September 1781. And so this was a joint mission, really. They walked together up until, as I said already, down to Yorktown. where they would, of course, finally fight against the British together and have their famous victory of Yorktown. So today, as I said, is the 240th anniversary of the route. And so there is this association called the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route that is organizing many events this year in order to celebrate this allied route, where, of course, there's so many stories to tell about the French and the American alliance, and especially all the events that occurred before going to Yorktown, how it was organized, and especially how that success could be achieved. With, of course, all the different people walking on the route, so the soldiers, but also all those that were the inhabitants along that route. So, for example, they've just released a John Troiani painting of the Rhode Island Regiment, as you can see on the slide. But they also had, for example, a New Jersey commemoration where you can see Rochambeau and Chastellux interpreters standing in front of a building that they used to visit at the time. And of course, they're making all these signs everywhere in order to say where the French and Americans used to walk during this march to Yorktown. They've also recently organized a bike and kayak tour that you can see here on the slides too. And so they also went to Mount Vernon. And so with an interactive map, you can travel along the route and learn about all the different steps that were important for this march to Yorktown, the march to victory. And so you can click on all these different places and learn about them on their website. So this website is w3r.com. But this specific presentation will, of course, be on Mount Vernon. And so on the 10th of September, the people walking on the route continued, so the soldiers, but George Washington stopped at his own home. And with him came, a little bit later than himself, the French staff, so Rochambeau, Chastellux, and their aides. So here, of course, you can see Mount Vernon. I'm sure most of you know this place very well. But so what's interesting, of course, that Washington himself wrote, I reached my own seat at Mount Vernon, where I stayed until the 12th. So he stayed, it's just for 3 nights, but still it's an important moment for him because this was the first visit home since he left to attend the Second Continental Congress in the spring of 75. So it means for 6 years he'd been absent from his own home, from his own bed, and of course, especially from his own family and the whole estate. So it must have been a very special homecoming for him. He had to rest there. That's one of the main things that they wanted to do. He invited a few others with him, so his own aide-de-camp, but also the French, as we will see later. And in a letter to Chastellux, he wrote that he wanted to halt there with the gentlemen to ease their fatigue and to give them fresh spirits to pursue our march the next day. And so you can also see that Washington was inviting someone. So he knew that Rochambeau was about to come because he was following him, but he explicitly wanted to invite someone else. So he said, it will add exceedingly, my dear sir, to the pleasure I experience to have the happiness to see you. I beg, therefore, that you will be so good as to join us with your agreeable company as early as tomorrow. So he's writing here to François Jean de Chastellux, who was the second in command just after Rochambeau. So he was the Major General who was mainly responsible for the logistics of the French army, and especially he was the liaison officer between the French and the Continental Army units. And so he organized a collaboration mainly. And Washington probably invited him because he got along with him very well, but especially because he spoke English, which they needed, of course. And so you can see that on this slide too, that there was one testimony on what actually happened. There's not that much more, but I will be able to reconstruct based on some other material. But here we can see that John Trumbull, who was of course the aide of Washington, wrote that there was a numerous family present, all accommodated. There was an elegant seat and situation, great appearance of opulence, and a real exhibition of hospitality and princely entertainment. So you have to imagine that this French party was greeted in all the manners of the time with the great hospitality and, as even say, quite a specific term, princely entertainment. And so for this specific day, the 10th of September, Rochambeau and Washington were together, and on the 11th, Chastellux came to join them. So, of course, Rochambeau, the general of the French Expeditionary Army, and Washington mainly had to plan their the coming march to Yorktown, but especially, of course, the siege and the battle that they had prepared. Here you can see a representation, which is a modern painting by Pamela Patrick White, of this situation, and why I chose to put it in and why Joe Stoltz advised me to put it in here is because you can see how Mount Vernon used to look at the time of this meeting. It was way different than the Mount Vernon we know today, because of course that's been sort of a recreation of a later period. But it looked a bit more simple, we can say, than the way we would imagine it today. But so at Mount Vernon, Washington came home because, of course, he was on the road to Yorktown, and it was a convenient place for him to stop. But the fact he invited the French with him means that they wanted to plan the last details of the march, and especially, of course, the tactical details that they had to still discuss on how to attack the British. Where was Cornwallis at this time? Where was Lafayette at this time? Where were all the different units that were marching slowly but surely to the south? Where were the ships that they needed? The fleet of the French fleet that left from Newport, but also the French fleet of Degrassi. All these different things had to be discussed. You can also see that on top of it all, they were writing many letters to everyone involved of the march, and especially the provisions were a problem, because you have to imagine that they were about 9,000 people walking, and they were going through all these different little towns, but it was, of course, sort of a whole city that had to be transported at the time. And so one of the things was they planned Yorktown, they planned all these different things, they were discussing the military details. But what I think is a bit more interesting for today's presentation is that, of course, they also had to cement their alliance. They had to show their mutual respect towards another. The French and American generals didn't have the easiest start of their alliance. And so the march and their cooperation from the beginning became one of these moments where both could show their trust in each other and so on. So that's where I will mainly focus on today, is this cementing of the alliance, the celebration of French-American new friendships, and especially this French-American trust that was built, which was an essential factor for the victory, the final victory at Yorktown, and especially the success of this march. And that's often a little bit forgotten, is these personal relationships between generals, the personal friendship that were developed over time. So the slide you see here is the way Mount Vernon looked at the time, because this was, of course, the sort of version of 1778. So this is less grand, as I already mentioned during the picture or the painting that I showed. And so what I just said about the friendships was very much, I would say, displayed by George Washington. He invited the French, and so it had to be grand. Here is just sort of an imaginative way of how it could have looked at the time, but it is quite certain that they would have served food on the patio and then afterwards on the eastern lawn, as is been done quite often still today, because, of course, it was still in the hot summer months. It was the beginning of September, so they would eat outside probably. And of course, the dinner, which is, by the way, at the time served around 3 p.m. So this is the moment where everyone would gather around the table, was an important moment in the day. And you can, of course, imagine a large table full of beautiful porcelain, all these decorative elements, lots of food, of course. Probably there was beef, goose, mutton, that's kind of food served, cabbage, potatoes, maybe some fish. And as a dessert, they would go for pies and tarts and cheeses. This is all accompanied by beautiful port and Madeira and wine and certain types of beers too. And at the end of this dinner, how they called it at the time too, everything was removed from the tables, and then raisin, apples, and nuts would be served for the guests that they could take themselves. And of course, a very important thing that was done always at the table, and especially you can imagine here with George Washington and the French, they had a lot of toasts. So toasting to the success of their march, toasting to the success of their alliance, and especially toasting to defeating the British finally. And what's an interesting element here is the French military and especially aristocratic etiquette. So what I would say about George Washington, and about especially the fact that he invited these French generals on the route to Yorktown at his private home, showed that he was showing this sort of famous hospitality of his to start with, of course, but it was also that he had to show that he understood and even adopted the French ways of receiving, and especially that he understood the social rituals, the values, the ethics that they had, the specific language. Well, of course, he didn't speak French, but the way to behave, his appearance, these were all very important, and especially for the French army. In the French army, the high-ranked officers were all from nobility, and noble ethics, noble etiquette, codes of conduct, and so on were extremely important. And in all the different accounts of the French officers you can read today in their journals, you can always read about that they appreciate when someone is behaving well, if he has polite manners, if he's speaking in the correct way, if he has decent clothing. All these things are very apparent in all the French testimonies. And specifically, Rochambeau and Chastellux were extremely careful with this themselves, but were very judgmental if someone was not the way they wanted or they thought it was supposed to be. And George Washington was well aware of this. And since the beginning of his life, as we know, he was studying the rules of civility and decent behavior in order to be able to move in the social circles he wanted to move in, and especially to be, of course, accepted in these circles. This was, of course, the highly elite circles of the British first during the 13 colonies he was part of, and especially the high classes of Virginia. And so these codes of conduct were, of course, important to him, but they also became important for him and the French alliance. In order to be accepted, of course, he had to behave in a certain way. And so for him to invite the French, you can imagine that he had to show off everything. And so he had to become a member of, let's say, the European military club, of which the French were part, and on which I could expand a bit further after. Here are some sort of modern representations too about this agreeable company that they would have. And what I want to focus on now in the last sort of part of this presentation is the fact that this was not at all an easy task for George Washington, nor for Rochambeau and Chastellux, to be able to really trust each other and to work together up until this long road to Yorktown, of course. So we have to go back in time a little bit. So back to July 1780, so about a year before their arrival at Mount Vernon, and especially their common victory at Yorktown afterwards, the alliance started in a very complicated way. When the French arrived in July 1780 in Newport, they were faced with very sharp cultural differences based on many prejudices. They were thinking that they had really important cultural differences. And of course, they had very different cultures and different backgrounds. This was for their own culture, their religion, certain manners and ways of living, but also especially the military differences were very apparent, because the French army was a highly trained, ancient army of hundreds of years, of generations of officers that had been fighting, had been drilled in all the different exercises, and especially were wearing magnificent uniforms. And they were known as being one of the grandest armies of the world. And in contrast, the Continental Army was, of course, a very young army. It's only been started a few years ago. And most of its officers and soldiers had other occupations before the war, and were mainly, of course, for example, farmers. And so a lot of French would look down upon the Continental Army and its militia especially. So this is a complicated way. How do you work together with these complications and these prejudices? And especially the 7 Years' War was still in the memories of many, because of course then they had fought against each other. The Americans, or the American population, let's say, was of course serving in the British army, and so fighting against the French. And on top of there was the Jumonville affair, in which Washington was held accountable for a murder of a Frenchman. So everything was very complicated. So what do you do in a certain situation like that? First of all, the French themselves were very conscious. If we don't change this complicated relationship we have with these Americans, we will not necessarily succeed. They had already seen that 2 years before, because D'Estaing, that was another campaign sent by the French king, had failed, especially because of these real miscommunications and misunderstandings on both sides. So the French started to organize dinners for the local population, for especially, of course, the elite that was been invited, but still they would invite local people from Newport, and they would especially invite officers and other prominent people of America at their headquarters in Newport. They organized balls, they invited or they organized trade with the local community for their own provisions, and they gave money for the reparation of damaged properties. So you can see that from the beginning, they were trying to make this relationship better. And so during the first time that Rochambeau and Washington met in September of 1780, the relationship was maybe getting a little bit better than the real beginning, but it was still extremely complicated. And it was mainly because the French had not brought as many men, nor money, nor ships with them as Washington had hoped for. And in the other way around, Rochambeau felt very sort of almost strict because Washington admitted to him that he had way less men than Rochambeau had believed, and way less money and weapons and so on too. So both were even faced with more difficulties there because on both sides they could almost do nothing to fight the very mighty British army and navy that were, of course, already in place in America for a long time. So they made two plans. They were thinking of maybe going to New York City or to the southern states. But overall, they decided to wait. They had to wait for more reinforcements, both from Congress and from the French court. And so they decided to, postpone their actions and wait until the new season. And so this led to a real despair within the French staff, as we can read in Chastellux' paper in one of his reports called "On the State of Our Army," where he said, "We wanted to crush the English. We thought the occasion favorable. But all in all, we have contracted an alliance with rebel subjects. We will have to feed, clothe, pay the Americans, and even fight for them." And then he said about his own army, "The aid we sent in America is very mediocre and unlikely to give an advantageous opinion of our strength to our new ally." But he has a solution. All these problems could maybe be resolved if they would start to work together way more profoundly than they've done before. Of course, both armies were quite far apart from each other. Some of the officers were in contact, but no one else was really, they were really apart from each other. So Chastellux proposed that a few officers would work together to enlighten, he says, the ambassador, so the French ambassador, on their situation, but especially to travel together to see the whole army, so the Continental Army, because the French had only seen the Newport, Rhode Island militia, and they were highly disappointed. But they thought, what if we go and look for the other army units of George Washington? And they also wanted to measure the disposition of the people. So I think what's interesting here is that as a solution, he says we should work together. We have to fight, and we have to ask the Americans to help us. We need help. They need help. So let's all work together. And his main goal is to make all these prejudices disappear that started from the beginning. These prejudices, by the way, were quite funny for us today because they thought the Americans had ideas that the French were effeminate. So they were like women. Because they were paying so much attention to their hair and to their clothes, that they were not the real men that they would expect from to be fighting in an army. And at the other side, the French considered the Americans really as living on the peripheries of civilization. So they were almost wild in their opinion. So, okay, Chastellux had seen a few of them and was like, no, we have to fight these prejudices and see the reality. We should also see the reality of the American terrains and the American possibilities of fighting against the British. So they started a group, and this is quite unknown because it was supposed to be stayed secret. And so in the papers of François-Jean Chastellux, but also of someone else called Vieux-Ménil, who was his direct colleague, and so he also has lots of private papers that are today unpublished, we can read that there was a real group of Gallo Americans, as I say. That's by the way, Chastellux' own term. He called this group the Gallo Americans. Of which he himself was part, together with Vieux-Ménil, his two aides-de-camp called Montesquieu and Lynch, Montesquieu being the grandson of the famous philosopher. And then there was Dumas and Damas, who were Rochambeau, his aides-de-camps, and then de Turpin was an engineer who was making lots of maps. And on the American side, you had Knox, and of course the famous Alexander Hamilton, David Humphreys, and Stillman, Lafayette himself too, and then George Washington actually participated to a few of these moments where they were really working together to understand one another and to understand the military possibilities they were in. And so they traveled together. Chastellux traveled with his French, let's say, party, and he would meet with all these American people I just mentioned along the route, and they would show him around. So you could, they went from Rhode Island to Connecticut to New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware, Massachusetts, and Virginia. So they did quite a big tour, and this lasted from the autumn of 1780 up until the spring of 1781. And one of the real turning points for Chastellux himself, but also for the French in general, was the meeting with George Washington himself. So as I said, they believed that most Americans were sort of living on the peripheries of civilization and not to be taken seriously. But there was one huge exception, and that was George Washington. And the first time he writes about him in his travel diary, you can see that it's all about a dinner. So you can here read that Monsieur de Lafayette was in conversation with a tall man, and it was the general himself. And so they were having dinner when he arrived, and so he says that a fresh dinner was prepared for me, and then a few glasses of claret and Madeira accelerated the acquaintances I had to make, and I soon felt myself at ease near the greatest and best of men. And in this whole excerpt, he goes on and on about how admirable Washington is, how polite he is, how he knows all the social rules of conduct. And I think Washington was doing this in a very conscious way because he needed the French and he knew how to, let's say, seduce them. And so this travel is really a turning point because, again, the French and Americans start to work in a small team together to figure out what they can do to fight the British, but also to study more the other elements of the war that are important, that are a little bit broader than just tactics. So they would study agriculture together, commerce, science and arts even, that are all factors to be taken into account in the understanding of the other, the understanding of another culture, the understanding of the development of a country, and so on. So all these factors were taken into account in the study of war, and this is what you can call the Military Enlightenment. But the fact I wanted to talk about it today is especially it's interesting because it's creating a bond between this small group of people, and these are, you could call them the mid-level officers of the war. They were not deciding, well, apart from, of course, George Washington, they were not directly taking the decisions, but they were preparing all the work there. And by doing so, friendships were formed, or at least mutual trust was created. So after their travels, they would receive George Washington in splendor in Newport. And you can see that they, in this quote, they organized a huge parade where all the French would stand in lines, 5,000 men lifting their hats and their caps. And there was a sea of plumes of all their uniforms. So it was spectacular. And again, this is done to cement the alliance, to create faith and trust in this French aid that was sent to America. And here in, so March 1781, after all these travels I just described, Chastellux himself organized a dinner for George Washington. So he had brought silverware from France, apparently in huge quantities. He brought lots of silver with him, and he especially brought his own wine because he was a little bit afraid of the quality of what he would find in North America. And here you can see where that dinner was held. It's in the Maudsley House still today in Newport, which is now a private residence, but apparently it used to look quite like this. And so Washington was invited, but Chastellux invited about 50 other people of the French army, the Continental Army, and the local elite inhabitants of Newport and its surroundings. And so in March, you could already see that the French had done all their research, the Americans together, they had created new bonds, they had way more information than they had before, they gathered all the military intelligence, but they were not done yet, of course. They still had to make a decision. Where are we going? Are we going to attack New York? Are we going further south to the Chesapeake Bay? So a new meeting was organized between Rochambeau, Chastellux, and Washington to decide on this important question. And it was still up in the air where they could go because still, as it was the case in the autumn before, they did not have information on how many troops they would have, how many ships they would have, especially the French fleet was still not there and they were just waiting. But they decided to continue and to start a campaign. So they decided here in the Webb House, that is also today on the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route, is a museum. They decided right here that they would start their the junction of the two armies. So again, the French and American soldiers were always apart from each other, but now they would join in order to start a campaign. So they started the first leg of what is called the March to Yorktown, but they didn't know they were going to Yorktown back then because they were still up in the air. As I said, they were hesitating, do we do New York or do we do Yorktown, which was mainly had to be decided upon by the numbers of troops available. But the French and Americans, so these Gallo-Americans, had already done the research to determine which options would seem better. In order to really make this decision, they organized together. So I'm putting a real emphasis on the fact that they organize all these things together. It's a joint action, and it's all about mutual trust and mutual engagement. So they organize a mission in New York in order to determine, can we attack this well-fortified city, which is the center of the British power? And they figure out after a few days of organizing, again, this together with Washington's troops and Rochambeau's troops. In one of the reports of Chastellux, you can read, it must be admitted that they would require much superior means than those we can and could dispose of. The enemy could make our best hope vanish in an instant. So the conclusion of this new action to figure out if they could attack New York is negative. They cannot attack. This is why they make the decision to go further. And you can see here, George Washington himself on August 1st, I could scarce see a ground upon which to continue my preparations against New York. It was his ardent wish since the beginning to attack New York because it was the symbolic power of the British, but also there where he was defeated, of course, a few years before in a very heavy way. But he has to admit, I can't do it. We don't have the means, so let's go south. And he knew that this was possible and that all the possibilities were there also for the march because the Gallo-American group had already done investigations around the Chesapeake Bay, around Yorktown, and they decided to go there. The march, so I said that it was prepared in just a few days, but you can already feel that I'm going to tell you that no, it was prepared for a longer period. But so they would walk many, many miles from New York City, kind of today, to Yorktown. And so this is when Rochambeau and Washington and Chastellux, of course, are hoping to hear about Degrassi. So Degrassi is the French admiral of the French fleet. And of course, they already had heard when they were in New York a confirmation that he would come to the Chesapeake Bay and that their joint action could work out. So they hear about him. And what they didn't know yet at the time was that he actually won the big battle against the British at the Chesapeake Bay, which permitted him to block the bay and to keep Cornwallis there and to do the whole Yorktown campaign, which is not the subject, so I won't go into too many details. But what's important is that Degrassi was there and they knew he was coming. They would hear about his victory only on September the 14th because information traveled quite slowly at the time. However, there was real hope right now. So when George Washington, Le Comte de Rochambeau and Le Chevalier de Chastellux arrived at Mount Vernon, they were quite confident about the success of this new campaign. Again, as we know, it was very hard from the start. It was extremely complicated to find a common ground with these extremely different two units of armies, the French Expeditionary Army with the American state militias and the Continental Army didn't have that much to go on first. But during the course of the first year of their alliance, they would work together in a small group, and it will really lead to their common and very good decision to not go to New York, but to go further and to attack in Yorktown, which ultimately, of course, led to their victory. And so I would argue that their friendships and the fact that they both really made a real effort to understand each other's cultures and to adapt to one another. George Washington would adapt to certain French ways of doing things, but also the other way around. The French, for example, would take the habit of toasting and would do it, even if secretly in their diaries they write that they think it's quite a strange thing to do, but they would do it openly. So both would adopt their own the social codes in order to be able to work well in of course, as a main goal with their military alliance. And so after Yorktown, they continued the route, of course, as we all know, because they had to go south again. But so you can see that they would not stop only with these things at Mount Vernon. There was also, for example, an elegant supper in Williamsburg, so at George Witt's residence, which is also still, which is a museum today. And you can even read in George Washington's diary that an elegant band of music played an introductive part of a French opera. So even French culture was exchanged there and was shown in this larger part of creating this alliance and that it would work. And as some of you might already know, but which quite, I thought, a surprising dinner that was also held was the dinner with Cornwallis after Yorktown. So after the surrender of Yorktown, where of course Cornwallis was not present himself because he was sick, just after that, there was a dinner organized with all the generals present. So there was Rochambeau, there was Washington, and also Cornwallis. And of course, people like Lafayette and Chastellux also attended. And even funny anecdotes that they created sort of a hole in the ground and they decorated it with many flowers and they put a tent upon it to create this very special universe in which they would celebrate the end of this specific battle. Of course, they did not celebrate the end of the war because they did not know it was, but it's still quite a particular thing maybe for us that these generals would have dinner, but at the time it was part of the rituals and the social codes of the French and especially British aristocratic officers to have these kind of social events together. And so they invited George Washington, showing that they considered him really as their equal, which was, as I already said, not necessarily the case at the beginning. So we can really see this evolution here of this friendship that was evolving. And so as a conclusion, trust and friendship is really a crucial factor for the success of this alliance, which is often overlooked because we tend not to look at very particular social relations between the people. But I would argue that this trust that was between these different generals with such a complicated campaign, with also such a complicated mission of bringing about, of course, 9,000 people on foot and then lots of other units from other sides too, to attack the British simultaneously, that required a lot of logistical sort of genius, but also insights and daring to do things that were actually quite, of course, dangerous. And so here we can see that both ways sort of adapted and adopted to their customs, and there was a real exchange of cultures happening here at the same time. And just by way of another little conclusion, of course, we know that a few other dinners have taken place, and one of the most recent French-American dinners at Mount Vernon, in this same kind of light of French-American diplomacy, was still held in maybe the same room as where the French and American generals have met. But to end on a more happy, lighter note, there was a real friendship, as I already said, developing between a few of the generals. Some were, of course, just cordial, respectful relationships. Some others really evolved to actual friendships. And one of them is between Chastellux and George Washington. So here's a quote of a letter that George Washington writes to Chastellux, which is quite a surprising tone that he's having, because normally George Washington is considered to be quite serious, but here he's making actual jokes. So this means that there is really more than their military relationship between these two gentlemen. So he says, "You have taken a most effectual method of obliging me to accept your cask of claret." So claret is a specific type of Bordeaux wine, and as I said, Chastellux brought French wine with him. And so that I shall, by a refusal of this claret, bring my patriotism into question and incur suspicion of attachment to the French nation and of regard to you. So you can only relieve me by promising to partake very often of that hilarity which a good glass of claret seldom fails to produce. And so for the occasion, I have some Madeira with me. Of course, I could have had some claret, but I think Madeira is more appropriate because Washington and Chastellux were drinking quite a lot of Madeira together, as well as with Rochambeau. So I would like to say santé to this lovely French-American friendship that was blossoming during this American Revolution.
It was wonderful, Iris. Thank you so much. It's fabulous as always. If anybody has any questions for Iris, just go ahead and put them in in the chat, and our producer will send those up to us as soon as she can. I think one of the things I'll just kind of buy some time while we're waiting for some questions. I mean, one of the things I find so fascinating with your project is the extent to which, I mean, we literally still do, we in the sort of, NATO ally sense still do this today, right? You alluded to that with the president, or with the picture of President Trump and President Macron. But I mean, that winter you talk about between 1780 and 1781, where they're actually, units or bands of French and American soldiers going out together to go visit recent Revolutionary War battlefields.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a staff ride. If anybody watching is familiar with, what the U.S. military and what NATO allies go do today, right? This is just a joint forces staff ride where they can go ahead and the Americans can sort of brief the French on this is the tactics that the British are using in North America. French can ask the Americans, well, how did you handle that? And then, either say, oh, that's a good idea, or say, well, that was good, but maybe what you could try next time would be, and I mean, that's, like you said, that's, I completely agree with you. It just seems like such an important step that was not available when they did the first two campaigns together in Newport and Savannah in the years earlier. And I think I'm contractually obligated as a Mount Vernon employee of mentioning this is something we're still facilitating today. So just 2 years ago, our viewers probably wouldn't have heard about this because it wasn't really advertised, but we actually had some of the joint staff of both the French and American armies out to here at the Presidential Library. And I mean, they doing the same sort of conversations that I suspect Washington and Rochambeau were doing then. So thank you, Iris, as always. Brad wants to know if you'd be willing to speak more about the motivation of the French to engage in overseas nation building. It's a great question.
Broad question too. Thank you very much, Brad Fay. By the way, Brad Fay is part of the wonderful Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Roots Association. And he is one of the organizers of this day today, of the celebration of the 240th of the 240th anniversary of this special meeting. So about the motivation of the French to engage in the overseas nation building. So this is a question relating to why did France participate in the American Revolutionary War, of course. So there are many reasons to point out. So the French King Louis XVI, of course, was quite, well, the king before him at the 7 Years' War, but at least the French kingdom was humiliated during the 7 Years' War. That was that happened a few years before, and so the French needed to get wanted to get their place back on the theater, the global theater, let's say. So they wanted to especially diminish the power of the British in order to do this, because in the 7 Years' War they lost, especially against the British, and they lost their American colonies to the British. So there was a chance of revenge, you could say here, and there was a real chance for just getting their place back by joining this cause of the American Revolution. There were other reasons too, which is especially the hope for the future development of trade, of commerce between the French and the Americans, because of course the French were hoping to have this huge territory for them to trade with. And so this was one of the other main motivations to join. And of course, there were a few were very inspired too by the promises the revolution held. This is not the most important reason. I think the more geopolitical reasons are a bit more, the most important ones. But there were quite some French philosophers and people at the French court believing in the ideas of liberties and freedoms that the American Revolution, let's say, promised, especially as an alternative model to the monarchy they were also themselves living in. So there was a real hope for renewal and for a new experiment at the other side of the Atlantic that a few of the French officers actually themselves really believed in too, with of course one of the most famous ones being Lafayette, but then also Chastellux himself was really inspired by this idea of seeing with his own eyes what the alternative to a monarchy could mean. And most of them were still very inspired by this after that they came back from America, and some were starting to think about reforming France, not necessarily to do the exact same thing as in America, but at least to adapt France to some more modern, progressive, and especially enlightened ideas. So there's this mix of reasons. for the French to engage in this. And when the French arrived, you could even see that the question, since you call this nation building, I think that's an interesting question. It's not only to fight the war against the British, but it was also to help within the nation building process. And of course, some of the French officers, inspired by the French Enlightenment, had ideas about what is a nation, what's a democracy, how do we build this republic, and so on. So they were actively participating in these debates at the time, and especially dinners were obviously a perfect occasion for that, because that's where you share these kind of things.
Stephen wants to know, do you have any idea the approximate size of Degrassi's fleet at the Battle of the Chesapeake?
And so the size of Degrassi's fleet, I would have to look that up again, but I think it was 38 ships or something. Is that, Joe might know this better than me.
But I don't remember off the top of my head. I think the British fleet was not 200 ships. I mean, the Royal Navy might have had 200 ships of line.
So
like,
I remember vaguely that it was, I think, well, it's not important. I don't know the numbers for real, but it's about 200 ships for at the end of the question, you see the British fleet, 200 ships in the bay. That's very unlikely. I'm quite certain that is too large of a number. And I remember that Degrassi brought 6 big ships of the line with him, and then a few other of these accompanying ships. And he brought about 3,000 extra soldiers with him too. But for example, Rochambeau, when he came with the whole 5,000 large French army, he had about 30 ships of the line with him too. But the important thing to say about Degrassi's fleet, it was big in size. It was big enough in order to fight against the British Navy that was based. So there's of course just a part of the British Navy. And I think what you might mean, Stephen, in the question is that maybe the whole entire fleet of the British Royal Navy was composed of 200 ships. But in America, there were way less because they were dispersed all over the world. And that's the same case for the French one. But why it was very important that Degrassi came is that without the French fleet, the whole campaign would not have been possible, because the British had to be sort of blocked from the bay. Otherwise, from New York, they could have been bringing lots of more ships, and especially many more soldiers with them, in order to fight against the Franco-American army. And so the fleet was of crucial importance for this specific battle, and in general for the American Revolution. And that's why the French were waiting so long for this aid of Degrassi, and that's why they also decided to go to the Chesapeake Bay, because that was an easier route to go to, and many other factors. But it was extremely crucial for the victory at Yorktown that Degrassi arrived at the same time as all these soldiers that were marching. And so that's what shows kind of the genius behind the Yorktown campaign, is that all these different units arrived at the same time, and that it worked.
All communicated with literally just passing notes to each other, right? I mean,
Exactly, yeah.
Let's see. McHugh wants to know, were any of the French officers put to death during the Revolution?
Yes, many were put to death under the French Revolution. Most of as said in the question, but most of the officers, or actually all the officers, were of the French nobility. And as we all know, their fate was, very complicated, because of course most finished under the guillotine at the time. But for example, Rochambeau, he was freed from what's called la conciergerie. So conciergerie being the prison where you were held before the trial and before going actually to the guillotine. He was freed because he had some relations, so he didn't. He survived the revolution. Lafayette himself was also imprisoned but survived. And quite a lot of the sort of other officers also survived the revolution, which was mainly sort of out of luck, or because they fled the country. Most of them émigré. Some French officers came back to America actually during the revolution, also as an émigré. That's how you call those that left. But others also died naturally already before, such as Chastellux, who I'm of course talking a lot about. He just died just before the outbreak. But overall, you can say that quite a lot did die in the revolution, which is quite sort of the big paradox here, because the French helped the Americans to build their republic, and then when coming back, they unfortunately died.
Let's see. Did Rochambeau ever make any notes about Washington's enslaved valets' presence or service?
Mm-hmm. So that's a good question because, of course, during the dinner I mentioned very probably the enslaved valets and servants were serving the food, making the beds, everything you can imagine at Mount Vernon. Rochambeau himself is mentioning slavery in his memoirs, but just very briefly, not that long. Some other officers are writing quite extensively about slavery in general. However, they don't necessarily discuss that much about George Washington's enslaved on his plantation. It could be for the reason that they don't want to talk about that subject, or that because they are in full admiration of George Washington in sort of almost exaggerated way sometimes. But so of quite a few of the French officers, such as Dumas, for example, Mathieu Dumas, there was an aide-de-camp Rochambeau. He is commenting a lot about slavery, and especially when he goes to what he calls the Sugar Islands, he becomes horrified of slavery, and some would join abolitionist movements after the war. Yes.
Is there any record of the interaction or conversation between Cornwallis and Washington at the organized dinner?
I've never seen that testimony. Maybe Joe has heard of it. I don't know.
I think what happened at the dinner stayed at the dinner.
Yeah, exactly. They drank a lot of Madeira, that's for sure. But what I do think is that everything was very formal, very organized. And what I said about that tent that they built, it must also just been quite a fun night because it was still quite warm. They had this tent with lots of flowers and sort of little trees around, and it looked like a sort of a fancy picnic. That's what they wanted to make it look like. So I'm sure they spoke about the battle, but also about some other topics that were of interest to them that were maybe not at all related to the war.
Yeah, I think that's one thing. A lot of I'll only speak to American audiences since they're who I interact with the most, but are the most sort of surprised by with 18th century military culture is the extent to which you being an officer in that country's army was a professional thing, and you showed professional courtesies to other the officers of another country, and it's sort of this idea of like it's nothing personal, it's only business because we're just doing this because the king told us we have to, and there's sort of less emotions wrapped up in it, or less personal emotions maybe. I don't know if that's your observation.
I think that's interesting. The personal emotion, I think, for example, what I've seen as for during the 7 Years' War, for example, the British and the French officers, of course, they fight against each other. But just after the war, there's the whole concept of the Grand Tour. So from France to Great Britain and the other way around is booming. And so all the French are extremely interested in the British constitutional system, in many of their like political elements that they can study. They are very interested in their culture in general, and the other way around too. So I think they kind of exclude the idea of what we could feel as you have an enemy you fight against. You're serving your king, and you're serving what he is telling you to do, as Joe just said too. It's professional. And at the same time, you can be in complete admiration of those you're fighting against. But then, of course, there's also, at the same time, also feelings of revenge and hatred. So it's of course more complex than that. But at the time, especially in these aristocratic circles, all these officers had their polite manners of dealing with each other. And I think their personal emotions were not to be shown in general, but especially not if you actually had some revenge feelings towards each other during dinner. You didn't show that.
Yeah. Were Lafayette and Hamilton at the dinner?
I would assume that they were, yes, but I don't have any source material to prove that. But I would be surprised if not, because they were so engaged in all of this, and they were especially also very involved in what I call this the Gallo-American reconnaissance tour that they were doing in winter. They were very involved in that, so they were really this group of French-American friends. So I would assume they were.
Can you comment on how French military involvement in the Revolutionary War was viewed by the common people of France at the significant time in French history?
Yeah, so it was followed very much here in France. There was a public opinion very much in favor of this, the French aid to America. Lots of newspapers were reporting on it very often, of course, with a huge delay because of the time difference. I mean, the long time of traveling for news. But there was lots of reporting. There were lots of even theater plays. There were theater plays about George Washington, even here. So there was a real enthusiasm for the cause of the American Revolution, and every letter that would arrive from the French officers here in Paris were read aloud in the salons. The French court had parties or like events with, for example, how do you call that? A ship, like an American or ship of the French fleet in their hair. The women had these huge wigs with these things, so they were called the Liberty wigs. You had this sort of a craze, and Benjamin Franklin, of course, was here in France, creating this sort of real hype about the American Revolution. So the common people overall were very much engaged in this. Of course, a few people were a bit more critical because it was extremely costly to join this American cause. And so the French had to invest a lot of money. So a few of the French army administrators and the administrators in general were very afraid of this, the consequence of such a huge investment. And they were not wrong because, of course, one of the reasons for the French Revolution to break out was the bankruptcy of France after this. So it's a mixed reaction, but overall you can really feel enthusiasm for the American cause by especially sort of the overall public opinion.
That might be the last question. So if that's the case, Iris, it has been a pleasure as always. We look forward to welcoming you back here to Mount Vernon at your earliest possible convenience.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. It was really a pleasure to see you and to talk with you and exchange about this French-American alliance. And thank you to Mount Vernon in general for everything that has been happening for the last years, and especially the support for the book, for the documentary. Everything is, of course, we're very grateful, because I don't think all my work would have been possible without Mount Vernon. So thank you very much. And of course, also thank you to W3R for organizing this event and having the idea of organizing a sort of 240th anniversary for this wonderful day of the 10th of September, where Washington-Rochambeau and Chastellux were all together before the victory.
Well, that's going to do it for us, folks. I will say, in the spirit of Franco-American cooperation, we at Mount Vernon are also, even though it's lunchtime here, we're taking a page from our French allies. So, Iris, it was lovely to see you again. Chin chin.
Chin chin. And I'm going to really drink because I'm in the good time zone. So for me, it's about 7. So.
And if our boss is watching, we're totally going to pour that out afterwards.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, thank you so much. And I hope to see you very soon in the United States. That would be the best.